Morning, you're listening to Retake Our Democracy, a 30-minute weekly show that airs at 8:30 a.m. each Saturday morning on KSFR 101.1 FM, your Santa Fe public radio station. Don't live near Santa Fe? Well, you can stream the show live from ksfr.org anywhere in wherever you can get a good internet connection. So you can listen to KSFR from Albuquerque, Taos, Las Cruces, or even Europe. Hi, I'm Paul Gibson, the host of Retake Our Democracy. Before we get to the heart of today's show, I want to remind you that if you are listening to this show while driving around town and miss any of it, you can watch the full YouTube recording of this show and any prior interview by going to retakeourdemocracy.org and clicking on the Retake on the Radio button on the lower right side of the homepage. You'll find recordings of all our previous shows that are listed in chronological order. Retake takes pride in delivering compelling interviews on important topics, so when on the Retake on the Radio page, take some time to review all of our old interviews. You can find something very interesting there. Lastly, before we get started, I want to acknowledge that we are conducting the show on stolen Tewa land, and I want to thank our Tewa neighbors for being such good stewards of the land. We could learn much from their custodial caring for the land, water, and air, and we better learn soon. We're running out of time. Lastly, today's show focuses on a bit of news. Retake is taking a leave from KSFR to continue our focus on next steps for Retake and next steps for Roxanne and I. So for this last show, I want to outline what we've accomplished over these last 7 years, how it was accomplished, and with whom. And I will also touch on our reasons for pausing our advocacy and focusing on what should be an exciting and sustainable future for Retake. Our advocacy began when we managed the Santa Fe for Bernie campaign beginning in the summer of 2015. Bernie's campaign inspired many progressives to get in the game, and it certainly inspired us. The Bernie campaign flowed almost seamlessly into managing the Retake the Roundhouse effort, and then launching Retake Our Democracy after the 2016 Democratic Convention. We've not taken a break throughout all that, moving from one form of advocacy to the next without much deliberation about our approach, focus, or organizational structure. And as I reflect on what we've accomplished over those years, it is a very mixed bag with lots of important wins and as many, or almost as many, gut-wrenching defeats. Certainly, the election campaign work of Retake the Roundhouse and its allies was essential to creating a legislative environment conducive to passing forward-thinking legislation. Campaign work included organizing and supporting intensive statewide canvassing and phone banking campaigns in support of candidates committed to creating a far more progressive legislature. An important part of that work was to also remove legislators who were persistent obstacles to progressive legislation. These election efforts yielded important results. There is no way we would have repealed the heinous 1969 legislation that criminalized abortion in New Mexico without first defeating John Arthur Smith, Clemente Sanchez, Mary Kay Papin, and Richard Martinez at the polls and removing them from the Senate, while also electing a significant number of women of color to the House, progressive women of color. While that's not necessarily a tautology or redundant. While the abortion decriminalization bill justifiably got most of the attention, a host of legislation expanding free early childhood education, steadily increasing the minimum wage, making progressive changes to our state tax code, and vastly expanding the child tax credit, legalizing marijuana, passing community solar, reducing the shameless small loan cap from over 400% to 36%, and passing impactful gun violence prevention legislation are important advances, and none of these could have occurred without the transformation of the legislature that began in 2016 in the House with the removal of Debbie Rodella and Carl Trujillo and the election of Susan Herrera and Andrea Romero, being just the most notable of the changes to the House. Because of other important primary and general election wins elsewhere in the state, between 2016 and 2020, the House became a far more diverse, far younger representation and with far more women. And we completed the job in 2020 in the Senate elections with the rejection of the fiscally conservative and socially conservative Democrats Smith, Sanchez, Papin, and Martinez. These election changes made possible the passage of a great many hugely important bills that impacted the lives of hundreds of thousands of New Mexicans. Retake the Roundhouse also played a role in retaking the PRC and installing commissioners who were not simply industry dupes, but who took seriously what they heard in testimony and from the hearing officer's findings, often concluding that a utility, usually P&M, had disregarded ratepayers and the health of the land, water, and people near the fossil fuel operations. Electing Steve Fishman, Cynthia Hall, and ultimately Joe Maestas created a PRC with the smarts to see through utility smoke and mirrors and the courage to reject their specious, self-serving arguments. As with the legislative advances, we must not skip past the importance of the transformation of the PRC, even if it was a brief transformation. It importantly rejected the Avangrid merger and is forcing P&M to clean up its San Juan mess without foisting the costs on ratepayers. Outside the election contest, Retake built a following of blog and alert subscribers who didn't just read the blog, they took action, appearing at hearings, giving testimony, and writing and calling legislators, as well as canvassing for good candidates during the election cycles. Working with allies like Indivisible, Albuquerque, Yucca, Renewable Taos, Voices for Children, Mid-Rio Grande Water Advocates, New Mexico Food and Agricultural Council, Los Alamos Study Group, Think New Mexico, New Energy Economy, and others, we press for ever more transformative legislation. We shouldn't skip past these legislative wins as they have had a transformative effect on our most vulnerable New Mexicans. While there is a good deal more to be done to create a more diverse, robust, and progressive tax system, the expansion of the child tax credit in and of itself is lifting tens of thousands of New Mexican families out of poverty. It is easy to see this as one bill among many, but for poor New Mexico families, it is life-changing. What's more, in a few short years, we will begin to see the impact of our vast expansion of free early childhood programming across the state. While policymakers, legislators, and advocates may have to wait for the data to come in, New Mexico families and children are experiencing the impact right now, and it is massive. The abortion decriminalization bill not only made safe, accessible abortions available to New Mexico women, it made them available to women able to make the trek to New Mexico from less progressive states, and that's another huge win. While 36% loan appears absurdly predatory, imagine being so desperate that you will put your car as collateral to get a $500 loan to repair that car so you can continue to get to work and to pay off that loan and its 350% interest, a loan whose balance only grows and grows, and that despite timely payments. For those most vulnerable New Mexicans, that same $500 loan can now actually be repaid. What a difference. While clearly far weaker than desired, passing community solar legislation in 2021, and after years of efforts, has emboldened environmental advocates to push for more impactful legislation like local choice energy, an important public utility option that once passed will make it possible for local jurisdictions and their residents to be freed from the shackles of corporate monopolies like P&M and allow those jurisdictions to chart their own path to energy democracy, lower rates, and accelerated achievement of 100% renewable energy. We can't take these advances lightly. These are very big deals, especially for our most vulnerable New Mexico families. But sadly, in the last two sessions, we seem to have encountered the limits to where the Democratic Party would go. We found bills to create a public bank, a great green amendment, and local choice energy all stalled, obviously succumbing to industry machinations behind the scenes. It felt like the thousands of calls and emails and well-organized public comments increasingly fell on deaf ears, or rather on ears that were now tuned to a different constituency than voting Democrats. In the last session, even modest environmental bills that sailed through the legislature were suddenly summarily vetoed, often without comment or reasons given by the governor, while bills rejected by legislative committees found funding for those initiatives with funds slid unnoticed into a 200-page budget bill in the last days of the session, entirely bypassing legislative scrutiny. So the soundly rejected hydrogen initiative nonetheless found funding slipped into the budget, while the governor's executive order authorized the state to work with Sandia and Los Alamos labs and utility partners like Avangrid to seek federal funding to advance what the legislature had rejected. Meanwhile, the governor launched a coordinated campaign to punish the PRC for its soundly rejecting the PNM Avangrid merger, ultimately passing a bill to put a constitutional amendment on the ballot to replace the elected PRC commissioners with governor appointees, using a pile of dark money, mostly from PNM, to fund a mountainous misinformation campaign to mislead voters into thinking that passing the amendment would professionalize the PRC. The amendment passed. Put another way, the amendment was designed to create a commission that did the governor's bidding and her corporate allies. After all, who could oppose taking the politics out of the PRC and professionalizing their work, which is the way it was characterized in amendment publicity? The governor-appointed commissioners appeared to have gotten the governor's message on Avangrid, meeting behind closed doors with Avangrid and PNM lawyers to craft a path forward. I'm pretty sure voters weren't looking for this kind of professionalization. So there have been wins and there have been losses, but of late it has felt like a shift was occurring where it was acceptable to ignore constituent and legislator views, to do the bidding of business and industry. Increasingly, we felt a different kind of advocacy was called for, something less reactive to the moment, something deeper where dots were connected and constituents were informed more deeply and systemically, and enough to build a movement not focused on 24 good bills, but focused on a broader, deeper systemic transformation. And so, as the 2023 legislative session wound down, Roxanne and I realized that what was needed next was more than we could do. What's more, we realized that we weren't getting any younger, and so a new kind of organization was needed to meet the challenges ahead and to fully take advantages of the coming opportunities. Ultimately, we announced in our last blog that Retake would take a 6-month hiatus, so Roxanne and I have time and energy to address some long overlooked personal aspirations and to restore balance to our lives. It is time to figure out how to make Retake a permanent advocacy organization. We feel pretty strongly that what we are doing now is not sustainable, and yet we also feel the platform we've developed warrants being sustained. So in the second half of the show, I'll describe our understanding of what needs to occur to realize a more robust, sustainable, and influential Retake Our Democracy. But first, we need to take a break to remind our listeners that KSFR is more important than ever, offering timely news and alerts and a wide range of programming to keep you informed and sane in these ever so challenging times. In an era replete with misinformation, at KSFR you get the straight scoop, the fact-based news from Amy Goodman on Democracy Now!, The View from Europe and the BBC with the BBC, and KSFR's own excellent state and local news. You also get great music and informative discussions on timely issues, with Richard Wolff's Economic Update and Retake Our Democracy offering a progressive powerhouse of socialist radio each Saturday morning from 8 to 9. You may not always agree with all you hear on KSFR, but you will always be challenged. KSFR has graciously supported this show for over 6 years, and this is a good time to offer thank yous to some of the key staffers who have made this and other shows possible. Folks like Marilyn LeBlanc, who as the program manager at the time gave Retake a shot and a weekly time slot, Sean Conlon, and more recently Chase Smith, who each managed to transform 31 minutes of weekly content into a 28-hour format while preserving the flow. I'd also like to acknowledge the work of content director Eric Davis and Tazba McCullough, the general manager of KSFR, who keep the train on the tracks and on schedule. No doubt I am missing someone else who should be acknowledged, but these are the folks with whom I have interacted most and who have supported Retake as its show has evolved. Without those folks, none of what you hear on KSFR would be possible. So those of you who can afford it, after you've listened to this show, please consider making a contribution by going to ksfr.org and clicking on the donate button and tossing $10, $20, or even $50 their way. We'll view it as your ticket for admission to a wealth of awesome and rich programming. And I might add, you probably have your $500 or $1,000 check coming in the mail about now. So maybe you can devote some of that to KSFR as well. Let's get back to our discussion. In the first half of the show, I discussed how Retake and its allies have worked together over the last 7 years. I discussed some of what we've been able to achieve and where we have fallen short. Now I want to spend the rest of the show to discuss what we feel could or should come next. The reflective process that comes next is both personal and organizational. To understand our thinking and the need to hit pause for a bit, you have to understand a bit of our personal motivations, priorities, and capacities as they influence how we try to structure a sustainable organization. Let's start with Roxanne. Before launching Retake, Roxanne had started 2 novels. As an accomplished writer, she had, even before she met me in 2009, she had written well over a dozen short stories, some completed works and some in need of 1 or more passes. She has had scant time to return to her writing, something that requires a disciplined and persistent approach, something impossible to achieve when writing action alerts and editing blogs. She also has a passion for our vegetable garden, and for just being outdoors, also difficult to sustain while pushing Retake forward. As for me, I received my master's in literature from Cal Berkeley and recall the days when I'd have to read Brothers Karamazov and David Copperfield in the same week for 2 graduate seminar classes. To keep up, I had to consume massive quantities of double cappuccinos, but the seminar discussions were inspiring and instructive. Since founding Retake, I'd barely read a short story, let alone a 500-page novel, until recently joining a book club and rediscovering my love of literature. That is a habit I want to sustain. You grow from that work, from that reading. And like Roxanne, I have aspirations to write as well. While her aspirations are grounded in more developed writing, I've had a couple of pieces in outline form just gathering dust for the past 6 years. I've got the outline of a novel and another nonfiction narrative on U.S. politics that attempts to connect the dots between how capitalism and colonialism has defined our nation, who it serves, who it enslaves, and who is largely ignored. In the back of my mind, I'm hoping I can find a way to merge these nascent texts into one. But nothing is going to be accomplished while these aspirations are parked in the back of my brain. Beyond these aspirations, Roxanne and I have 3 adult kids and 2 grandkids, one of whom we've only seen on Zoom. These kids live on different ends of the U.S., but despite geographic challenges, we want to find ways to connect with them more often and more personally as we go forward. That requires a comment in itself. I'm 72, Roxanne is 5 years younger. In the past 4 years, mortality has sent us a clear message. 4 years ago, I was rushed to the hospital with what was determined to be a saddle embolism lodged in my lungs. 2 years later, thanks to Roxanne's diligence, I again was rushed to the ER with a blood clot. Either of these events could have killed me, if not for the excellent and timely medical interventions I received. Message to us: tomorrow is not guaranteed. Count your blessings. Don't put off important goals and aspirations. Drain that bucket list while you can. And so before we figure out a future path for Retake, we need to forge one for us and figure out what we have left in the tank for Retake. When we moved to Santa Fe in 2012, we had retirement on our minds, not second careers. But our work with Retake has led us to believe that there is great value in an advocacy organization that spans issues and offers a broad policy agenda with an election arm that can help create the kind of elected legislature that will embrace and advance that policy agenda. Although we haven't had time to fully flesh out that plan, we do have some ideas worth sharing. First and foremost, we need a staff with different talents and backgrounds, with at least one person who is fearless with technology and social media. Roxanne and I are well aware of the degree to which we could get far more bang for our buck with technology. But while we have learned much over the years, there's much more to learn and apply. We need a policy wonk or researcher with serious writing chops, possibly an election specialist to identify, engage, and encourage new candidates to run for office and to support their efforts. And we'll need a skilled administrator to oversee all of this and keep the education arm separate from electioneering, with Retake being the election arm and our newly formed 501c3 tax-deductible Rethink Our Democracy being the education arm, with these two arms being completely separate. We are not exactly certain where our legislative advocacy falls in this two-armed beast, but with some telling us it is solid 501c3 work and others saying there are subtle nuances in where this work should be housed and the kind of advocacy we do. These are among many details we need to sort through, clarify, and finalize. And to do that, we will be engaging an organizational consultant with experience in New Mexico and an understanding of New Mexico state law as relates to nonprofit organizations. We'll need that help in order to make sure that whatever we set up is viable within the state. But before we determine staffing structure, roles, and responsibilities, we need to reflect on how the governing process seems to be changing and how calls, emails, and public comment during sessions seem to be proving less effective. How do we refocus and restructure our year-round advocacy work to maximize the impact of our collective voice during sessions? What does that look like? Are there statewide advocacy groups in New Mexico and in other states from whom we can learn? This will be important exploration that may lead to surprising results. We also want to think deeply about the form of education that our education takes and its target, with Roxanne Long taking the view that this education should target youth and young adults to inspire and educate them about the importance of civic engagement, and my having an interest in focusing on systemic issues to counter the demonization of government and advancing public policy that prioritizes people over profit, and then offering evidence of how the trend toward privatization and public-private partnerships and the abandonment of the public sector and government is far too often about profit over people or planet. I'm going to be honest, this is a little departure here. Since my stroke, the process of writing a blog or a radio show script has become far more challenging. First, I suffer from what is called left side neglect, a common side effect of a stroke that occurs on the right side of the brain. So there is an ongoing challenge of getting my left hand to cooperate and not hit the control or the caps lock key when trying to hit the A key. The A key hit a lot. Either misstroke can cause mayhem, especially hitting the control key and the A key simultaneously, because then I've selected all that I've written, no matter how much, and replaced it with the next letter I type. 2 hours of work can be gone in 1 second and can't be retrieved by a series of Control-Z undos. If I've gone merrily along typing, not realizing what has disappeared. And I've had those moments where I look up and I'm like, what on earth just happened? This may be too much info for radio, but it undermines my motivation, as rather than looking forward to writing, I often dread it, an obstacle that can be addressed and or accommodated. So whatever form Retake assumes going forward, we need to account for this and structure things so that the writing is dispersed among others. So that is where we stand. Roxanne and I need to take a few more weeks to sort through our priorities before turning to the Retake Rethink issues. We will use the blog to keep you posted and to publicize opportunities for your input, as we will undoubtedly do create those. We sincerely hope you find ways to sustain your personal advocacy while we are on hiatus. And to advance that, we are working on an ally page on our website that will be complete in a week or so. It will provide links to how to follow seasoned progressive advocacies focused on specific issues, many of whom send out regular educational emails or convene Zoom meetings to discuss policy options. We will announce that being published in a blog that will be published when the page is complete. So stay tuned. If you aren't signed up for our blog or our action alerts, you can sign up at retakeourdemocracy.org and sign with sign-up buttons on the right side of the page. Thanks for joining us this week and over the years. This has been a really hard show to script because every time I want to step away, I want to step back in. There have been so many issues in the past 3-4 weeks where I've wanted to jump on the computer and write a blog, but I have to discipline myself to stick to the task of looking long range on where we want to go with this organization. I'm not quite sure what KSFR will do with this slot going forward, but I think they will offer some retake reruns for a bit before settling on a permanent program. And in closing, I want to note that we've been told that KSFR will work with us to find a slot when we are ready to return to weekly shows, but nothing is guaranteed, certainly not a return to this high-profile Saturday morning slot. So next week, KSFR will surprise you. In the meantime, look for our blog to keep you appraised of progress in forging the transition. But before that is announced, Roxanne and I have to take stock of what we want to do with the rest of our lives before turning to how Retake can forge a long-term sustainable role in New Mexico policymaking, legislation, and the small d democratic process. So for now, so long. And thank you for listening today and for past years. Bye.